You know, it is a really strange reality of human anatomy that you almost never think about your own breathing until you are underwater.
Yeah, that is very true.
Like for the vast majority of your day, your lungs are doing this incredible rhythmic work of pulling in oxygen and pushing out carbon dioxide. You are sitting in traffic, or you are typing an email or watching a show, and you just do not give it a single thought.
Right. It is completely autonomous. You just do it.
But the second you dive into a pool and hold your breath, or the second you start choking on a sip of water, the mechanics of respiration become the only thing in the universe that matters to you.
Oh, absolutely. It becomes an instant crisis.
You become acutely, intensely aware of your need for air. Well, welcome to Reformed Thinking. Today, we are taking a massive look into a piece of source material that, it forces us to look at our spiritual lungs.
I love that analogy. It fits perfectly.
Because we live in an era of constant noise, just a barrage of demands on our attention, and a culture that constantly asks us to perform. So, in the middle of all that, what does true acceptable worship actually look like? Are we breathing healthily, or are we just holding our breath until we pass out?
That is the big question.
It is, and we have a fascinating document to help us answer that today. It is a sermon titled Praises and Vows Accepted in Zion, delivered by Charles Spurgeon.
A classic.
Yeah, it is based on Psalm 65, specifically the first two verses. We are drawing this from the Metropolitan Tabernacle Pulpit, Volume 17, which are provided text notes with a publication date of February 3, 2018.
Right.
The mission for this deep dive is to look closely at how Spurgeon breaks worship down into two primary actions, praise and vows. He offers a striking look at the spiritual respiration required to sustain a healthy inner life.
It is quite an intense text to unpack.
It really is. So, to help unpack all of this, I am joined by our resident expert. Let's just jump into this right from the start. Spurgeon begins with a very specific geographical and theological focal point, which is Zion.
Yes, he does.
He draws this massive distinction between the physical altar of the Old Testament and the spiritual altar of the New Testament. Can you walk us through that initial concept and why he starts there?
I would love to, because it sets the stage for everything else. Spurgeon begins by establishing a very strict rule from the Old Testament. Zion was the exclusive location where an altar could be erected for sacrifice.
Right, like the only place.
Uncompromisingly so. He points out that God expressly forbade worship on high places or, any random location a person might choose. If you lived in that era, you could not just build a shrine in your backyard because you felt a burst of inspiration.
Which is so different from how we think today.
Oh, completely. And there is a fascinating historical precedent he references here. The tribes of Israel, who settled across the Jordan River, so they were a bit far from the main hub, they decided to build a memorial altar.
Okay.
Now, these tribes were absolutely terrified of being misunderstood. They were incredibly careful to state publicly that this altar was not for sacrifices.
Wait, really? Why were they so scared?
Because they knew that building a secondary altar for burnt offerings would be seen as direct rebellion against the Lord. They almost started a civil war over it.
That is wild to think about, like a literal civil war over a pile of stones.
Yeah, the stakes were that high.
But why the intense restriction? I mean, why wouldn't God just want people worshiping him everywhere, on every hill and every valley? It seems almost counterintuitive to restrict it to one single zip code, so to speak.
Well, the restriction was a safeguard against the human tendency to dilute and distort things. If you let people build altars wherever they want, they will inevitably start blending their worship with the local customs.
Ah, I see. Like mixing it with whatever the neighbors were doing.
Well, spot on. In the ancient Near East, the Canaanite practices on those high places involved horrific rituals. By centralizing the altar at Zion, the worship remained pure, standardized, and focused.
That makes a lot of sense.
But Spurgeon uses this historical precedent to set up a massive theological shift in the New Testament. The fulfillment of this ancient type is that Jesus Christ himself is the single spiritual altar.
But the physical location doesn't matter anymore.
Right. Spurgeon completely rejects all materialistic ritualism. He states that any man-made altars today, whether they are constructed of beautifully carved wood, polished stone, or, gleaming brass, they are idolatrous inventions.
Wow, he doesn't pull any punches.
No, he actually calls them the beggarly elements of Judaism. He warns against those who use such things, describing them as clerical jugglers duping the sons and daughters of men.
Clerical jugglers, that phrase is so vivid.
It really paints a picture, doesn't it?
It does. It paints a picture of someone using shiny props to distract an audience from what is actually happening. I was thinking about this transition from the physical to the spiritual. It is a bit like constructing a magnificent soaring building.
Okay, I am following you.
While you are building it, you absolutely need scaffolding. The scaffolding is essential. You cannot put the bricks in place without it. But once the masterpiece is finished, you take the scaffolding down.
Right, because if you leave it up, it obscures the beauty of the building itself.
Yes. So in this analogy, the physical altars, the high places, the rituals of the Old Testament, that was all scaffolding. Christ is the finished building.
That is a great way to frame it.
But here is where I want to push back slightly on human nature and, frankly, on myself. Why do we always seem to want to return to the scaffolding?
That is the million-dollar question.
Like, why are physical objects, wood, stone, incense, whatever, so incredibly tempting for us to incorporate into our worship, even when Spurgeon insists the physical type is completely done away with?
I think it is because we are inherently sensory creatures. We rely entirely on sight, touch, and spatial orientation to prove to ourselves that something is real.
So we want something to hold on to.
Yes. The theology of the true Zion, as Spurgeon explains it, requires a massive cognitive and spiritual leap. He states that the true Zion is where the church gathers around the one finished sacrifice of Christ.
So it is a spiritual gather, not a physical one.
Correct. Christ is the church's head, heart, altar, and priest. But Christ is not physically standing in the room. You cannot walk up and touch the hem of his garment today.
Which is hard for us to process.
Very hard. It requires faith to gather around an invisible spiritual center. Scaffolding, on the other hand, is tangible. You can run your hands over carved wood. You can smell the incense burning. You can see the gold plating.
It gives you an immediate physical sensation.
Right. Human nature craves the tangible because it feels like a shortcut to the divine. If I can touch this brass rail, I must be close to God.
Oh, wow. That is a dangerous mindset.
It is. Spurgeon warns that this shortcut actually leads to idolatry. The psychological mechanism here is dangerous. By focusing on the material object, the worshiper's gaze is lowered from the infinite, unseen God to a finite, created thing.
So you end up worshiping the wood instead of the Savior.
Precisely. You settle for the shadow instead of the substance.
So for the listener, think about the scaffolding in your own life right now. Maybe it is a specific routine or a physical space you feel you need to be in to feel spiritual, or even like a specific style of music.
Yeah, music is a huge one.
If someone took that away from you tomorrow, would your spiritual building still stand, or would the whole thing collapse because you were actually relying on the props?
That is a tough self-audit to do.
It really is. Which brings us directly to how we are supposed to interact with that infinite God. Since we are not bringing physical sheep or bulls to a physical altar of stone, what are we bringing?
And this is where Spurgeon introduces that incredible concept of spiritual respiration.
Yes. He defines prayer and praise as the breathing in and out of the air that supports the inner life. Prayer is breathing in, seeking nutriment, and bringing our needs to God. Praise is breathing out, giving fruit and revenue back to the owner of the vineyard.
The breathing analogy is structurally brilliant because it highlights a biological necessity. You cannot survive by only inhaling, nor can you survive by only exhaling. The lungs require a rhythm.
Right. It has to be a cycle.
And Spurgeon warns against a very specific danger here, the church becoming what he calls a solemn wail.
A solemn wail. That sounds depressing.
It is. He notes that we are often pressed with wants, and so we hasten to cry, "Give us this day our daily bread." We are very good at breathing in.
Oh, for sure. We are excellent at asking for things.
We acknowledge the necessity of prayer by setting apart times for it. We have prayer meetings. We cultivate private prayer. We send out emergency prayer requests. But Spurgeon asks a piercing question.
What does he ask?
He asks, do we have praise meetings? Do we cultivate secret thanksgiving? A solemn wail happens when a congregation or an individual is entirely consumed with asking for things.
So they are effectively holding their breath.
Yes. They are holding their breath and forgetting to exhale in praise. He frames this imbalance as essentially selfish. Prayer is for ourselves, to find the nutriment we need. Praise is for God.
That hits hard.
To abound in prayer but fail in praise is to be eager to receive but entirely slack in giving a return for the boundless favors we enjoy.
It's like that one friend who only ever texts you when they need help moving a couch or borrowing money.
We all have that friend.
Right. They never text just to say hello or to thank you for being a good friend. Eventually stop wanting to answer the phone. Spurgeon is essentially asking, are we treating God like a cosmic moving company?
That is a great analogy.
Think about your internal dialogue over the past week. How much of it was inhaling? How much of it was presenting a list of needs, anxieties, and requests?
Probably most of it, if we are honest.
Right. Lord, fix this situation at work. Lord, heal my friend. Lord, give me patience with my kids. All of those are valid and necessary inhalations. But are you holding your breath?
When was the last time you consciously exhaled?
Gratitude without asking for
A single thing in return. Are you suffocating your own spiritual life because you refuse to breathe out?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the failure to breathe out is not just a personal detriment. It fundamentally alters the atmosphere of the gathered church.
How so?
Spurgeon is very clear that notes of exultant thanksgiving should perpetually ascend from solemn gatherings. If that exhalation is missing, the entire community suffers from a kind of spiritual hypoxia.
Spiritual hypoxia, like all the oxygen just leaves the room.
Yes, the community becomes entirely focused on its own deficits, its own lacks, its own suffering. It becomes a heavy, burdensome place. The exhale of praise is what brings buoyancy and life back into the community.
But there's a danger here, right? We have established that God is the only valid target for this spiritual exhaling. So what happens when we aim that exhale at the wrong target?
Misdirected praise.
Because human nature practically guarantees we will try to find a shortcut or a substitute. Spurgeon is unyielding on this point. He says praise must be exclusively rendered to God.
He is very firm on that.
He calls out the errors of giving praise to humans or deceased saints. He specifically mentions the practices in Rome and Babylon, referencing praise offered to the Virgin Mary or martyrs who are supposed to have power with God.
Right, aiming the praise at the creature instead of the creator.
But he does not stop there. He levels a massive, frankly uncomfortable critique at the Protestant church itself, warning that we often minister to our own selves during worship.
Yes, Spurgeon is incredibly egalitarian in his critique. He identifies the error of sending songs and prayers up to deceased confessors, but then he immediately pivots to say that those who consider themselves free from that error are often guilty of another one.
We idolize our own preferences.
Spot on. He calls out the prioritization of the tune, the organ, the choirs, and the performance over the actual object of worship.
He calls it making God's house into an opera house, right?
Yes. He states that God's house is meant to be sacred unto himself, but too often it is made into an opera house. In this scenario, Christians cease to be an adoring assembly and instead become a mere audience consuming a performance.
That is a sharp criticism.
It is. The minds of the people become more occupied with the due performance of the music than with the Lord who is supposed to be praised.
So the psychological shift is subtle but devastating.
Very much so. You walk into a building not to give something to God, but to have your own aesthetic tastes satisfied by the musicians on stage.
Okay, but let's be real for a second. I am going to fight for the listener's skepticism here.
Please do.
How do we balance a genuine desire for excellence in music with this severe warning against making it an opera house performance? If you have gifted musicians, you want them to play well. You don't want the music to be a distraction because the guitar is out of tune or the singer is off-key. Are we supposed to just embrace mediocrity to prove we aren't putting on a show?
That is a fair pushback.
Spurgeon paints this striking imagery of shooting arrows without a target. He says that if we do not lift our eyes and our hearts to him, we are just misusing words and wasting time. Singing words without aiming the heart at God's glory is like firing arrows into the sky with no target in mind. But surely aiming the arrow well includes holding the bow correctly.
You are right to push back, because it is a delicate balance. But this raises an essential question about the nature of God himself.
Okay, unpack that for us.
Spurgeon unpacks this by quoting the scripture that God is a spirit, and they that worship him must worship him in spirit and in truth. The balance you are asking about is found in the orientation of the heart, not just the technical proficiency of the hands or vocal cords.
So it is an internal metric, not an external one.
Yes. Spurgeon is not advocating for poor musicianship. In fact, he notes that even amid the simplest worship, where everything flashy is excluded, we can still fail.
Oh, really? Even without the big show?
Yes. He says we can drowsily drawl out the words and notes with no heart whatever. Drawling lazily is just as much a failure of worship as a flashy, heartless performance. Both miss the target entirely.
So the guy aggressively strumming a three-chord song in a basement while staring blankly at the wall is just as guilty as the megachurch choir director who only cares about the lighting cues.
Precisely. The mechanism of failure is the same. In both cases, the heart is disengaged. True praise requires the worshiper to realize God, to believe that he is, and that he's a rewarder of them that diligently seek him.
So the arrow is the song, but the target is the glory of the king.
Yes. If the congregation is focused on how beautiful the choir sounds, or conversely, if they are focused on how boring and dreary the simple hymn is, they have dropped their bow and forgotten to shoot.
The aesthetic experience, whether high or low, has replaced the spiritual engagement.
That is the trap.
And the music isn't the only distraction. Spurgeon also warns heavily against idolizing the minister. He tells the congregation to take heed lest the minister be set up as a demigod among them.
This is a huge point in his sermon.
He quotes a famous line, "Presbyter is only priest writ large," meaning that you can change the title of the church leader from priest to presbyter or pastor or lead communicator, but the human tendency to elevate that person to an unhealthy mediatory status remains exactly the same.
We love a charismatic leader.
We do. He even references the story of Paul and Silas at Lystra. The people there thought Paul and Silas were literal gods and tried to sacrifice bulls to them.
Which horrified the apostles.
Yeah, the apostles tore their clothes in distress, crying out that they were just men of, passions. They wanted no part of that worship.
The phrase arm of flesh is used here, and it is a crucial biblical concept. Spurgeon warns the congregation to look higher than the pulpit, or else they will be disappointed.
Look above the arm of flesh.
Yes. Look far above an arm of flesh, because an arm of flesh will utterly fail you. He says, we know that this man is a sinner. This is a vital safeguard against the celebrity culture that can so easily infect religious communities.
So the congregation must look through the minister to the Christ being preached.
Yes, the psychological trap here is that it is much easier to follow a human leader than an invisible God. A human leader gives you immediate feedback. A human leader can be impressed.
But if the minister becomes the focal point, the praise is once again misdirected.
Well, yes. Spurgeon says we would as soon worship cats with the Egyptians as burn the incense of worship to any order of man. To God alone shall all the praise of Zion ascend.
That is a staggering visual. Worshipping cats with the Egyptians versus worshipping a guy in a suit with a microphone. It really puts the absurdity of celebrity pastor culture into perspective.
It definitely humbles you.
Okay, so if praise is an arrow, God is the only target. We cannot aim it at the saints, we cannot aim it at the choir, and we cannot aim it at the guy in the pulpit. We have to aim it at God. But that brings up the next major question.
How often should we be firing these arrows?
Right. Do we just do this on Sundays for an hour? Spurgeon makes a fascinating pivot here into the mandate for continuous praise. He points out that the church doesn't just dissolve when the building empties.
That is a vital distinction.
The people of God never cease to be a church just because they are sitting in their living rooms on a Tuesday.
Spurgeon notes that some translators conceive the main idea of the phrase praise waiteth as one of continuance. It remains, it abides.
So it is an ongoing state.
Right. The holiness was never in the stone and timber of the building. It is in the living assembly of the faithful. Therefore, the people of God should maintain the Lord's praise perpetually. Their assembly should begin and end with praise, yes, but it goes much further than public gatherings.
He references Bishop Farrar's household to illustrate this, right?
Yes, the concept of an unbroken chain.
I found this detail incredibly compelling, almost obsessive in a way. Spurgeon says the bishop had a large family and household numbering precisely 24 people.
That is quite the coincidence.
So he assigned each person one specific hour of the day to be engaged specially in prayer and praise. He created a literal, continuous 24-hour circle of worship within his own home.
It is mind-blowing.
At 2 a.m., someone was awake praising. At 3 a.m., someone else took the shift. It is like a spiritual factory that never shuts down.
It is a remarkable historical anecdote. Spurgeon admits that we might not be able to replicate that today, and attempting it might even border on superstition or legalism for some, but he points to the underlying principle.
The desire for an unbroken chain of gratitude.
Yes. The psychological and spiritual discipline required to maintain that is immense. And he asserts that even in sorrow, this chain should not be broken.
That is the hardest part.
He references Job, who lost everything, his wealth, his health, his children, and yet still fell to the ground and said, "The Lord gave, and the Lord hath taken away, and blessed be the name of the Lord."
The expectation is that whether the sun is rising or the evening is closing in, or whether we are receiving good or receiving evil, The praise should abide.
Praising in the dark.
Praising in the dark, that is the ultimate test of the spiritual lungs, isn't it? Breathing out when you feel like you are suffocating.
It takes immense faith.
I absolutely love the phrase Spurgeon uses to describe the state of being. He calls it incarnate psalmody.
Incarnate psalmody. Praise enshrined in flesh and blood.
Praising spontaneously the way birds sing without being prompted, or flowers perfume the air just by existing, or sunbeams cheer the earth. It is not a scheduled activity on a calendar. It is a state of existence.
It becomes who you are, not just what you do.
But here is where things get really fascinating and where I have another practical pushback.
Go for it.
We start looking at the actual translation of Psalm 65, verse 1. Spurgeon notes that praise waiteth for thee can be understood in a few ways. One is the idea of subservience, like servants standing in a king's palace, fully dressed in livery, waiting silently to hear what the king's command will be.
Right, attentive waiting.
But then he offers another translation, praise is silent unto thee. He mentions Dr. Gill noting that the King of Spain's Bible reads, the praise of angels is only silence before thee, O Jehovah.
Silence as praise?
Yes, he literally suggests incorporating silence into public worship as the highest form of praise. Now, let's look at our modern era. We are accustomed to constant audio stimulation.
Oh, constant. We never sit in silence?
If I am driving, I have an audiobook on. If I am doing dishes, I have music playing. If a church service just stopped for 10 minutes of absolute silence, people wouldn't feel sacred reverence.
They would be checking their watches.
They would be wondering if the sound system broke. How does Spurgeon actually expect a room full of distracted people to reach a state where silence feels pregnant with meaning rather than just painfully awkward?
It would undoubtedly feel uncomfortable at first, but Spurgeon anticipates that discomfort and explains the underlying reason behind it. Why is silence the highest praise?
Yeah, why?
He argues that when the human mind actually begins to rightly conceive the divine majesty, words utterly fail. He quotes a poem saying, "Words are but air, and tongues but clay."
Words are but air.
Think about the mechanics of human language. Language is a tool we invented to describe finite concepts. Tree, rock, water, sadness, joy.
Right, earthly things.
When you take a finite tool and try to describe an infinite God, the tool breaks. It is insufficient. When you are confronted with the infinite merit of God's goodness and the sheer grandeur of his greatness, even the most eloquent, beautifully sung hymn falls painfully short.
So words just can't carry the weight.
They can't. Spurgeon confesses that worshipers often blush over the hymns they sing, mourning that they have fallen so far short of God's glory. The silence isn't awkwardness. It is the natural result of a system overload.
System overload. That makes me think of the Rowland Hill anecdote included in the text.
Oh, that is a great story.
There is this woman sitting near Rowland Hill, and she is singing with a horrible, harsh voice, and she is singing very loudly. Hill gets annoyed and tells her to quiet down.
Which is pretty harsh of him, honestly.
Right, but the woman looks at him and says, "It comes from my heart." And Hill immediately backs down, retracts his rebuke, and says, "Sing away."
He recognizes the sincerity.
Spurgeon uses that to say, if it comes from the heart, who would restrain it? Even loud, harsh singing is acceptable if the target is right. But then he contrasts that vocal, noisy enthusiasm with something even deeper.
Yes, he contrasts the vocal, harsh singing with a state of being completely overwhelmed. He uses a very raw, physical metaphor.
The barrel metaphor.
Yes. He likens the soul to a barrel filled with strong liquor. When the liquor ferments and expands, the pressure builds. It foams and swells until it literally bursts the hoops that bind the barrel.
The structure just gives way.
The pressure cannot be contained by the structure. Spurgeon says there are times when we have so much praise in our souls that it cannot be enclosed in mere words. We want all our nerves and sinews made into harp strings, and all the pores of our body made mouths of thankfulness.
That is an intense desire.
When the desire for praise reaches that level of intensity, the only expression left is a quivering silence. The barrel bursts, and silence becomes our praise. The human nervous system simply cannot articulate the weight of the glory it is experiencing.
A sacred reverence checks our songs, and praise sits silent on our tongues. That is a beautiful way to phrase it. It is not an empty silence, it is a full silence.
A silence packed with awe.
And Spurgeon notes that this silence is also expectant. We wait subserviently, yes, like servants waiting for a command, but we also wait expectantly. We are praising God in his outer courts, anticipating what it will be like to be with him in the heavenly mansions.
We are praising him for the grace we have not tasted yet.
That expectant nature is vital for sustaining hope, isn't it?
Yes, Spurgeon says, "When I cannot praise God for what I am, I will praise him for what I shall be." The praise is discharging a debt of gratitude for the past. But faith anticipates the future and begins to pay praise even before the mercy arrives in full.
It is a brilliant psychological reframing. Instead of waiting for the good thing to happen to be thankful, you are so confident in God's character that you express the silent awe of gratitude for the future victory right now, in the middle of the current struggle.
It changes everything about how you endure hardship.
So let's bring this back to the listener. Spurgeon prompts us to think about our common mercies. He lists things like having your health, not being stretched on a bed of sickness, having your reason, not being confined in an asylum,
Things we take for granted every day.
having your children and relatives around you, having bread to eat and clothes to wear. We call them common, but he calls them priceless, godlike mercies.
And then he moves to spiritual mercies.
Right? Iniquities purged, being washed in priceless blood, having an abiding place in God's court. So the question is, how are you processing these mercies?
Are you even noticing them?
Are you filling every single moment of your life with noise, with media, with chatter because you are afraid of what happens when things get quiet? Or do you occasionally allow yourself to sit in overwhelmed, bursting barrel silence, acknowledging a goodness that is simply too massive for your vocabulary?
That transition from praise to the internal quiet workings of the soul leads us perfectly into the second half of Psalm 65, verse 1.
Right, because we have spent a long time on the phrase, praise waiteth for thee, but the verse continues, and unto thee shall the vow be performed.
The forgotten practice of vows.
Spurgeon explicitly acknowledges that vow-making is far less common in our days than it used to be. He suggests that perhaps this is because superstition abused the practice so heavily in the past that devotion has grown half ashamed of it.
We associate vows with monks taking vows of silence, or extreme ascetic practices, or weird historical bargains.
But he reclaims the concept for the everyday believer. He outlines several different types of vows, and it is a pretty comprehensive list.
It is a rigorous inventory of the promises a person makes throughout their spiritual life. First, there are conversion vows, where a person surrenders body, soul, and spirit to the one who bought them. He calls this the love of your espousals, comparing it to a marriage covenant.
Okay, so that is the starting point.
Then there are baptism vows. He notes that in the solemn act of mystic burial, a person avows that they are dead to the world and alive in Christ. Third, there are church membership vows. Joining a church is described as an understood compact to promote unity, offer comfort, and propagate the faith. You are promising to be present for other people.
So it is communal as well as individual.
Fourth, there are ministry vows, where pastors, elders, and deacons implicitly dedicate their whole time and zeal to the flock.
And then he moves into vows made under specific, extreme life circumstances, vows in affliction and vows in joy. It is a bit like a forgotten New Year's resolution, but scaled up to life-altering spiritual promises.
Yeah, the stakes are much higher.
Have you ever been really sick, like staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m. sick, waiting for a test result? Spurgeon notes the promises made on a sickbed. If I am delivered out of this great trouble, I will consecrate my substance more to God.
The desperate plea.
Or the promises made in seasons of joy during the birth of a firstborn child, or the recovery of a spouse from a near-fatal accident, or a time of suddenly increasing goods. He likens this to Jacob at Bethel.
Where Jacob wakes up from his dream.
Jacob wakes up from his wondrous dream, takes the stone he used as a pillow, pours oil on it, and makes a vow to the Most High. We all have our Bethels. We all have moments where the veil thinned, we saw God clearly, and we promised we would live differently.
What is fascinating here is the psychological insight Spurgeon brings to these moments. There is a specific mechanism at play.
Tell us about that.
When we are entirely stripped of our agency, like when we are lying in a hospital bed in the middle of the night, the brain tries to regain control. Making a vow is a human attempt to negotiate with the infinite. The vow in anguish is born of absolute desperation.
And what about the vow in joy?
Conversely, the vow in joy is born of overwhelming gratitude, a sense that we have received far more than we deserve. Yet both share a common tragic vulnerability.
Which is?
Human memory is incredibly frail. Once the fever breaks, once the test results come back clear, or once the new baby is settled in the nursery, the intensity of the moment fades. Our agency returns, the panic subsides, and the brain conveniently deletes the memory of the negotiation. The vow is forgotten.
Ouch! He makes this intensely personal, which I appreciate. He doesn't just point fingers at the congregation. He confesses that he is preaching to his own heart.
Yes, he is very transparent.
He notes that he himself recently came from a sickbed, and he uses the sermon to charge his own heart to perform the vows he made in the dark. He is basically saying, I remember what I told God I would do when I thought I wasn't going to make it, and now that I am standing back in the pulpit, I have to actually do it.
That vulnerability gives his critique incredible weight. He also uses this intensely intimate language to describe these vows. He calls them private, chaste love passages between the soul and Christ.
Love passages. That is beautiful.
He says, if your life were written, you would say, let these not be told. They were only between God and my soul. He is challenging the listener to mentally open up their own private notebooks.
We all have those private notebooks.
Whether they are physical journals or just memories etched in our minds, think back to those moments when the tears started, when you saw God's goodness pass before you and you said, I am my beloved's and he is mine. What did you promise then?
He is asking for a rigorous internal audit. Are you living the life you promised you would live when you were in the crucible of affliction or the height of joy?
It is a sobering thought.
But making a vow or even offering praise feels incredibly risky if no one is listening. If you are sitting in a hospital room at midnight whispering a promise to God, or if you are standing in a church singing your heart out, what guarantees that any of it actually matters?
Right, what if you were just talking to the ceiling?
What if those arrows are just flying into the void? What if the universe is just cold and empty? That leads us into the final section of Spurgeon's thought, the encouragement found in the phrase, all flesh.
Yes, he moves to Song 65, verse 2. O thou that hearest prayer, unto thee shall all flesh come. Spurgeon builds a fascinating logical argument here.
Walk us through the logic.
He states that prayer is, in some aspects, the lowest form of worship. It is necessary, but it is somewhat selfish because it is asking for things. Praise, he argues, is a superior, elevating form of worship.
Because it is focused entirely on God.
Right. So the logic follows, if God is a habitual receiver of prayer, if he constantly bends his ear to hear the lower, groaning, somewhat selfish cries of human need, then he will most certainly accept the higher, elevating offerings of praise and the performance of vows.
Ah, I see. If he takes the lesser, he will absolutely accept the greater. He leans heavily into that phrase, all flesh. He says he is incredibly glad for that specific wording. God doesn't say, unto thee shall all spirits come. He says, all flesh. He accepts the grosser, feeble, broken cries of fallen human nature.
The theological weight of all flesh cannot be overstated. It is a radical leveling of the playing field. It means no class, no social condition, and no level of eloquence is excluded.
So the poorest person and the richest person are equal here.
The greatest monarch and the poorest peasant are on the exact same level before the hearing ear of God. Spurgeon rejoices that a broken, groaning prayer, even if it feels hoarse and feeble, will reach God because God is infinite compassion. He doesn't demand perfection of the delivery, he requires sincerity in the approach.
There is a wonderful, relatable domestic analogy he uses here. He talks about how hard it is to do things for someone who never seems pleased.
Well, we all know that feeling.
Many people know this feeling in a relationship or at a job. You do all you can, you bend over backwards, but the other person takes no notice of the little deeds of kindness. They only point out what you did wrong. It is exhausting. It drains the life out of you.
It really does.
But conversely, it is incredibly easy to serve a person who notices every little thing you do and says, how kind it was of you to think of me. Spurgeon uses this to reframe our view of God.
God is not an unpleasable boss.
Right. God is not a distant, unpleasable boss who is nitpicking our imperfect prayers or our out-of-tune singing. He is an attentive, appreciative receiver. Spurgeon says, the Lord thinks much of thy praises, much of thy vows, much of thy prayers.
That reframing is essential for anyone hesitant to approach God. If you view God as an unpleasable critic, you will hold your breath. You will never exhale praise because you assume it isn't good enough.
That makes total sense.
Spurgeon recounts an anecdote of a believing woman who prayed, Lord, I am content to be the second thou shalt forsake, but I cannot be the first. Her logic was based on the historical premise that God has never forsaken a sincere soul who came to him.
So she knew she was safe.
Since he has never forsaken the first one, she knew she was safe. Spurgeon uses this to assure the listener, if God says all flesh shall come to him, he will not look at you and say, but not such a one.
He will not exclude you. The invitation at the end of the text is incredibly broad, but also very specific about how to come. It says to come despite your infirmities, despite your emptiness, and despite your iniquity.
Come exactly as you are.
It uses this striking imagery, turning the vessel of human nature bottom upwards to drain out the last dregs of self before praying to be filled with the fullness of his grace.
That vessel metaphor is the perfect encapsulation of the entire discussion.
Yeah.
Worship, whether it is prayer, praise, or vows, requires emptying oneself. You cannot be filled with God's grace if your vessel is already full of your own self-sufficiency.
Or full of our own pride.
You cannot be filled if you are full of your own preference for the opera house performance or your own reliance on the scaffolding of material objects. You must turn the vessel bottom upwards. Let the dregs of ego drain out. Spurgeon concludes by pointing out to the reader that it is not your goodness that satisfies either God or you. It is God's goodness alone that satisfies.
This has been a massive progression through a dense, rewarding document. We started by looking at the exclusivity of the true altar, realizing that Christ alone is the center, and discarding the physical scaffolding of high places and material ritualism.
We really covered a lot of ground.
We examined the vital biological rhythm of spiritual breathing, inhaling through prayer and exhaling through praise, and the danger of becoming a selfish, solemn whale. We navigated the warnings against misdirected praise, avoiding the traps of the opera house performance and the demigod preacher.
Pointing the arrow at the right target.
We unpacked the beautiful paradox of silent praise, where the soul is so full of gratitude that it bursts its hoops and falls silent before the majesty of God. We walked through the solemn memory of forgotten vows, checking our own private notebooks of promises made in the dark of affliction or the bright light of joy.
And we ended on a note of immense grace.
And finally, we rested in the absolute assurance that a gracious God hears the broken, hoarse prayers of all flesh.
It is a comprehensive vision of what the inner life of a believer should look like. It demands rigorous honesty, but it offers boundless grace in return. The requirement to worship in spirit and in truth strips away our pretensions, but the promise that God hears all flesh gives us the courage to approach him anyway.
I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over. Spurgeon states that our highest praise on earth often ends in silence because our physical tongues and our current capacities are simply insufficient to express the magnitude of God. We are like the bursting barrel, we just cannot hold it all.
The nervous system overloads.
If that is true, what will it physically and spiritually feel like when, in the future, you are finally given the capacity to sing the new song without the limitations of this current flesh? When your vessel is no longer fragile?
That is an amazing thought.
When you have no words left today, perhaps that silence isn't a failure at all. Perhaps it is just the very beginning of eternity's language. Remember, you don't think about breathing until you are underwater. Don't let the noise of this world cause you to hold your breath. Exhale. Thank you for joining this deep dive.